But I do not believe that anyone in this room is undecided on who they're voting for president of the United States. I think we all know. And I think we should all do that as early as possible. Because, and I'm going to shift from the national to the local in a second, because while we all know what has to happen on the national level, we have to get voter turnout, particularly in the swing states. We have to get people to vote early if they're voting by mail. If you know people in the swing states, make sure to pass this along to them. But I want to talk about what's going on in San Francisco and California, partially because that's my expertise, and partially because it's also critically important. If people in San Francisco decide, well, it doesn't really matter because, Biden's going to win California overwhelmingly anyway. Even if I don't vote, California's electoral votes are all going to go to the Democrats. There's no way Trump can win the state, all of which is true. There's an awful lot else on the ballot that's really important. Okay, there are races and there are ballot initiatives. Let me just talk for a second about the district supervisor races. I watched yesterday morning Mayor London Breed addressing a forum held by the San Francisco Business Times. I subscribe to the Business Times. It's expensive, but I subscribe to it because I want to see what the other side is thinking. To be really blunt, I want to see what the real estate developers are talking about. And so I subscribe to the Business Times, and I always go to their forums. And when they're held in person, they always, I always go with a press credential, and they sit me way, way in the back to make sure I don't get to ask any questions, which is fine. This time there were no questions anyway because it was online. So I paid my $25 and I went to the online forum featuring Mayor London Breed talking about the economy of the city. And she spent most of her time talking about the Board of Supervisors. And when the moderator asked, why do we still have so many homeless people on the streets? She says it's the fault of the supervisors. That's because those are the people who are on the Board of Supervisors, and they're getting in the way of my agenda. And when they asked about housing, she said, I had a housing measure I wanted to put on the ballot, and the Board of Supervisors wouldn't do it. It's all petty politics. They're all playing petty politics, and they're disturbing the agenda of the city. This is the exact same thing that State Senator Scott Wiener said about a week ago in an event supporting his candidate for supervisor in District 1. And he said, we need new people on the Board of Supervisors because this Board of Supervisors essentially is getting in the way of the mayor's agenda. Now, my opinion, I have found that the progressive majority on the Board of Supervisors has done better work and more work in this last 2 years than I've seen in a long time on that board. I actually think we have a pretty good Board of Supervisors now. And I think that the majority has been able to accomplish an awful lot and has actually sometimes challenged the mayor's agenda. In the case of, for example, this housing measure that she was talking about, she wanted to put a charter amendment on the ballot to guarantee that 100% affordable housing could be built what they call by right. You just show up at the planning department with a permit and a check, and it gets approved. There's no planning commission hearing. There's no conditional use hearing. There's no appeal to the Board of Supervisors. Okay, that's great. 100% affordable housing. We're all in favor of that. Except that in her charter amendment, she changed the definition of affordable housing to include anyone who makes up to 140% of the average median income, which means if people would be eligible for affordable housing making around $100,000 a year. And the charter amendment also skewed the amount of affordable housing to say that the average affordable housing should be available to people making 120% of the median, which means that most of the quote affordable housing that's being built would be for certainly not for homeless people. Now, I'm not going to argue that we don't need housing for middle class people too, and that shouldn't be part of the mix, but the definition skewed that number much higher, thereby taking away affordable housing from the lowest income people. Okay, so it did that, and then it added this little twist that basically said, if you're a developer and you increase the amount of affordable housing above the statutory minimum by 3%, you get to build your building with no hearing, no conditional use hearing, no appeals. It just gets approved, and the neighborhood can do nothing about it. What that would mean, for example, in a 50-unit building, it would mean adding 1 or 2 more affordable units at the level of 140% of median. And this is important because that means the developer is not subsidizing the rent very much or the purchase price very much. And that 50-unit building gets built anywhere that they want, anytime, with no appeals. The neighborhood can't do anything about it if this is an inappropriate project, right? So the supervisors, I think appropriately, said no. No, we're not doing that. We're going to promote 100% affordable housing, but not with all of these loopholes for developers. So the mayor says they're in the way of 100% affordable housing. I'm telling you this because if you live in districts 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, or 11, in many cases, there are at least 2 candidates running, and in almost every case, one of the candidates is supported by the mayor and is supporting the mayor's agenda, and one of the candidates is supporting the progressive board of supervisors agenda, and that's pretty easy to figure out. And if you have any problem figuring that out, we can talk about that in the questions, but it's just really important to think in that context. If you think that market rate housing is going to solve our housing problem, then you should vote with the mayor's candidates. If you think that the city ought to be looking at that $50 trillion that the rich have stolen from the rest of us and trying to find ways to tax the rich and use that money for affordable housing, then you should vote with the candidate who sides with the progressive majority on the Board of Supervisors. Okay. Now, I have been asked, I think Art has asked, others have asked, will the Bay Guardian be doing endorsements as we usually do? And the answer is yes. Normally, the Bay Guardian will publish endorsements, and I print about 30,000 copies and distribute them around the city. I can't do that this year. And the reason I can't do it is all the distribution outlets are closed. We used to distribute it in bars and restaurants and cafes, and most of those places either are closed or are only open for takeout, so I have no place to put them. So what we're going to do this year is we're just going to do it on the web, and I will type in this right here, sfbg.com. If you go to sfbg.com, you will see the Bay Guardian endorsements for everything from President of the United States, and I think that one will not be a surprise to you, all the way down to local supervisors and local ballot initiatives, right? So that will be our endorsements. You should make up your own mind, but please keep it in that context, that there really is, that in a different way, the same question about whether we should be looking to the private sector to solve our problems or whether we ought to be looking at taxing the private sector and getting the government more involved in solving our problems is playing out in San Francisco too. Right? And as I saw this at the Business Times Forum. It's always interesting to hear the mayor speak to an audience of developers and business executives because she says, she approaches things a little differently than she does when she's talking to other groups. Anyway, so let me talk about taxes for a minute, right? Some of you have probably heard me say this before, but in the pantheon of the ways the government raises money, the best way, of course, is a progressive income tax or wealth tax. That's the most progressive way to raise money for government. That's tricky to do on the local level, although New Jersey, facing a huge budget deficit, just raised income taxes on the wealthiest people. They call it the millionaire's tax in New Jersey. They have raised income taxes on the wealthiest people as a way to balance the budget. So far, California has not done that. So far, Gavin Newsom has not pushed that issue. Neither, for example, has the state of New York, which also has an awful lot of wealthy people, where the governor has said, no, we are not raising taxes on the rich. Right? I don't know how many, this is an aside, but I don't know how many, I'm not going to ask how many, I can't see your hands. I don't know if any of you have read Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. It's the most important work of economics in my lifetime. One could argue it's the most important thing that's been written since Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes. It's profoundly important. It's thick. It's 800 pages. It's hard to get through. There's an awful lot of formulas and data and detailed stuff. But the nice thing about Piketty is you can read the first 100 pages and get the point. Right? And what he says, essentially, is that because of the factor that I was just talking about, because of the way that wealth has shifted upward not just in the United States, but globally over the last 50 years. The return on investments, in other words, the money you make by already being rich, exceeds the rate of gross domestic product growth in almost every country on earth, particularly in the United States. And if that continues, capitalism as we know it will be completely unsustainable. We're going to see great wealth and desperate poverty increasingly globally. And the only solution, Piketty goes through it all, and he talks about how, yes, people say we need to educate the workforce for the new jobs, and we need to spend more money on education and opportunity. And he basically says none of that is going to matter in the end. The only thing that's going to matter is a wealth tax. And it's got to be around 2% a year. That's the only thing that can save capitalism from complete collapse and decline. And he says that. And this is a guy who, he's French. He has been studying economics for a long time, and he's not a doom and gloom person, but he does say this is very, very serious. The only thing that we can do, the critical thing we need to do, is tax wealth at least 2% a year. Now, let's talk about that for a second. Jeff Bezos, during the pandemic, while people were suffering, while 20% of San Franciscans were unemployed, Jeff Bezos' net wealth increased by more than $25 billion. Why? Well, part of that is because everyone was using Amazon, but so did Bill Gates' net wealth. Right? So did the net wealth of most of the Uber billionaires, right? Because they're not making money by working. Jeff Bezos' money is not made by, it's the salary that he gets going into the office every day and wrapping up boxes and shipping them out. Of course, he doesn't wrap up boxes and ship them out. Right? Jeff Bezos is not making that money by doing that. He's making money as a return on his existing wealth. And as existing wealth gets greater, return on existing wealth gets greater and eclipses the amount of money the rest of us make by going to work every day by an ever increasing amount. So the most important thing we could do is a wealth tax, but you can't do that on a local level. It's actually very hard to do it on state level. I would love to see us try, but I think what would happen if we passed a wealth tax on billionaires in California, we'd have to be very careful because a lot of them would try to change their legal residence to another state. Right? I don't think they're going to. No one's moving to Nevada because they're, no rich person in California. Larry Ellison is not moving to Nevada because we increased his taxes by a little bit every year. But this is something that really needs to be done on a national level. Okay, but let's talk now about what we can do, which is the state and local level. And there's a lot. On the state ballot, there is one of the most important ballot measures in many, many years. And it's really important that people turn out and vote for this, and that's Prop 15. Prop 15 changes Prop 13's tax rules to allow commercial property to be taxed at its value. Right now, under Prop 13, commercial property is like residential property. It's that you can't raise taxes every year on property in California under Prop 13 unless it's sold. So when Prop 13 passed, commercial property in this state was paying about 60 or 70% of the total tax burden. Today, residential property is paying about 60 or 70% of the tax burden. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that residential property turns over more often. You buy a house, you pay taxes at the price you paid for that house. The person who just bought a house across the street from me is paying about 5 times the property taxes that I am because I bought my place in 1999. And the price of my house in 1999 was way lower than what the price that the person had to pay to buy a place across the street from me. But my house is the same value as their value. In fact, the guy across the street from me, his house is a little smaller than mine, but he's paying 5 times the taxes, right? Now, we could argue that's unfair. We're not going to get anywhere with that. We're not going to get anywhere in California changing Prop 13 for residences. And there's a good reason for that. It's because a lot of older people who own property would see their property taxes soar and they might lose their homes. Right? That's why we got Prop 13. Different for commercial property. Commercial property changes hands all the time, but is never reassessed. For example, you all know the Bank of America building, right? Bank of America building is owned 50% by Donald Trump. You've heard of this guy. Right? Donald Trump owns half of the Bank of America building, and the other half is owned by a real estate investment trust called Vornado.